Imagine you're a physician and a patient walks into your office with four symptoms. Each symptom, taken individually, has a straightforward explanation. A headache, well, that could be stress. Fatigue could be poor sleep. Joint pain, overuse. Digestive issues could be a diet issue. But a physician who treats each symptom independently and never asks whether they're connected isn't practicing medicine. They're practicing symptom management, and they're going to miss the real diagnosis. That is exactly what most organizations do when change or transformation stalls or outright fails. They identify the symptoms in isolation, resistance in one department, disengagement in another, communication breakdowns across the entire leadership team, passive compliance that masquerades as adoption. And they treat each one as a separate problem with a separate intervention. Training program for the resistors, an engagement survey for the disengaged, a town hall for the communication gap, and a dashboard for the compliance metrics. None of it, of course, works. And the reason it doesn't work is that these are not individual and separate problems. They're a dimension of a single underlying condition. And until you see the whole picture, your interventions will continue to address the symptoms while the condition progresses. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. This is Season 2, Episode 9. And today, well, is different from every other episode this season. For the past 8 episodes, we have been building a diagnostic framework for understanding why organizational change and transformation fails at the human level. Each episode isolated a single dimension, and we went deep on those dimensions. Episode 1 explored the identity crisis that transformation triggers in individual teams. Episode 2, with Elizabeth Stewart, my buddy, examined how emotional contagion spreads anxiety through an organization during change. Episode 3 unpacked the structural traps that middle management faces when caught between executive mandates and the frontline realities. Episode 4 looked at the algorithmic mirror, how AI and data systems reflect organizational bias back as objective truths. Episode 5 with James Elliott examined the organizational immune system, that invisible force that detects and neutralizes change the same way the body attacks a foreign pathogen. Episode 6 explored structural silence, the system that teaches people that speaking up is more dangerous than staying quiet. Episode 7 examined the psychological contract, the unwritten promise between organizations and their people that transformation and change always violates. In Episode 8, the last episode with Ryan Vett, explored the generational fault lines that determine how each of these dimensions plays out differently depending on when someone entered the workforce. 8 dimensions, 8 episodes, each one grounded in peer-reviewed research, each one validated by practitioner experience. And each one, I believe, essential to understanding why many organizational transformation and change efforts continue to fail at rates that have not improved in decades, despite the billions of dollars invested in change management tools, methodologies, and consulting engagements. Here's the problem with building a framework one dimension at a time. The audience, and I include myself in this, can begin to see each dimension as a standalone diagnosis. You hear about the identity crisis and you think, that is our problem. I know how to fix that. You hear about emotional contagion and, well, you think, that is what's happening in our leadership team. And I know how to fix that. You hear about structural silence and you recognize it immediately in your organization's culture. And you may know how to fix that. But the reality is, none of these dimensions operate in isolation. They interact, they amplify each other, they create cascading effects that no single dimension intervention can address. The resulting consideration then can be overwhelming, if not downright scary. So today, we're going to map the interactions and focus this episode on showing where the individual pieces become a system, one that you can leverage to improve change and transformation success. Let me start with the most important thing that I have learned across change and transformation engagements, along with the 2 decades I have spent studying why organizations resist the changes they say they want. The organization that fails at change and transformation, they're not the ones that misidentify the problem. They are the ones that correctly identify one dimension of the problem, and then they build their entire intervention around that single diagnosis. We as humans, well, we default too easily to a single diagnosis. We default too easily to short-term thinking, often without seeing the consequences, the influences, the factors, or the variables that connect to each other, that are dependent on each other, and that compromise the foundation that we seek to build and build upon. Peter Sang identified this pattern decades ago in his research at MIT's Sloan School of Management. In the fifth discipline, he demonstrated that organizational problems are systemic and that leaders who intervene on single leverage points without understanding feedback loops consistently produce unintended consequences. He called one of the most common patterns fixes that fail. So that's where a solution to one problem creates new problems elsewhere in the system that eventually make the original problem so much worse. That's precisely what I see in change-focused engagements. And the reskilling example I'm about to walk through is a textbook case of that. Charles Perrow's research at Yale on complex systems made a related observation that I think applies directly to organizations and change and transformation. Perrow demonstrated that in tightly coupled systems, failures in one component unpredictably cascade through connected subsystems. His original research focused on industrial accidents, but the principle translates. When the human dimensions of an organization are interconnected, which of course they always are, an intervention that addresses one dimension without accounting for its connections to others doesn't just fall short. It can trigger cascading effects that make the overall situation worse. Let me give you that practical example. A chief human resources officer recognizes that people are afraid of losing their jobs to AI. That's a correct diagnosis. That is, of course, the identity crisis from episode 1, along with the psychological contract violation from episode 7. But the intervention they design, a reassurance campaign, and a reskilling program doesn't account for the fact that the anxiety those employees feel isn't staying contained in their individual experience. It is spreading through the organization via emotional contagion, that dynamic that Elizabeth Stewart and I explored in episode 2. And, well, it is spreading fastest through informal networks, hallway conversations, Slack channels, and the spaces where structural silence from episode 6 has already taught the people that leadership can't be trusted with honest feedback. So the reskilling program gets announced. And the people who most need it, well, they don't sign up. not because they don't want new skills, because signing up feels like an admission that their current skills are obsolete, which then triggers the identity threat. And the leaders and the human resources chief interpreting the low enrollment read it as resistance or apathy, which then triggers the organizational immune system from episode 5 to label those employees as change resistant, which further entrenches the silence, which accelerates the contagion. One problem, six dimensions interacting simultaneously. And while the original intervention, the reskilling program, addressed exactly one of them. This is saying fixes that fail playing out in real time. And it's Perot's cascading failure in a human system. This is the pattern I see and I hear about repeatedly. Not bad strategy, not incompetent leadership, but a fundamental underestimation of the systemic nature of the human factors to determine whether change and transformation succeed. Yeah. The medical analogy from the opening is not rhetorical. It is structurally accurate. Organizations are treating symptoms and completely missing the diagnosis. So let me walk through the key interactions, the places where two or more dimensions combine to create effects that are greater than either one alone. I want to be clear that what I'm describing is not a theoretical model. These are patterns I have observed across multiple engagements, validated by the research we have discussed throughout every episode of this season. The first and perhaps the most powerful interaction is between identity crisis and the psychological contract. When change and transformation threaten someone's professional identity, their sense of who they are and what they're good at, they don't just feel anxious, they feel betrayed because their identity was built on an implicit promise. The organization told them through years of performance reviews, promotions, and institutional reinforcement that who they are is valuable. And now change or transformation is redefining what valuable means. That identity crisis activates, but it activates through the lens of a psychological contract violation. And that combination, well, it produces something far more powerful than either dimension alone. Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman's transactional model of stress, one of the most widely cited frameworks in psychological research. It helps explain why this combination is so potent. Their work demonstrates that stress responses are not addictive, but multiplicative when multiple appraisal processes are activated simultaneously. Two stressors do not produce twice the stress. They can produce a qualitatively different and more intense response. So when identity threat and contract violation converge in the same person during the same change or transformation, the resulting experience isn't just more intense, it's categorically different from either stressor alone. It produces what William Bridges called the ending, the psychological experience of loss that must be acknowledged before any new beginning is possible. Most organizations, as I have said over and over again, they skip this entirely. They announce the change, they launch the initiative, and wonder why people who were such high performers are now disengaged or actively undermining the effort. The answer is the organization violated a contract it never knew it had signed. And that violation landed on an identity it never acknowledged that it had shaped. Remember Ryan's leadership example from last episode, where most of the key staff departed in 6 months. It's a great example. The second critical interaction is between emotional contagion and structural silence. Anxiety during transformation is, of course, inevitable. People are uncertain, they are processing loss, they are trying to figure out what the change means for them personally and professionally. That is all normal. What determines whether that anxiety becomes productive or destructive is whether people have somewhere to put it. Elizabeth Morrison and Francis Millikan's research on organizational silence, which was published in the Academy of Management Review, identified something that I think every leader needs to understand. Silence in organizations is not the absence of opinion. It is a learned behavior that becomes self reinforcing at the systemic level. When the organizational culture has taught people that honest feedback is punished, that raising concerns is career limiting, that the real conversations happen after the meeting and not during it, well, the anxiety doesn't just dissipate, it goes underground. And underground anxiety is where emotional contagion does its most corrosive work. Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler's research on social contagion demonstrated that emotions, behaviors, and attitudes spread through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. When you combine that finding with Morrison and Millikan's work on silence, you get exactly the dynamic that I see in organizations during change and transformation. When people can't express their concerns through legitimate channels, they express them through informal ones. The rumor mill, the parking lot conversations, the group texts. These channels have no mechanism for accuracy, no accountability for what gets said, and no way for leadership to respond. So then, the anxiety amplifies, distorts, and spreads without any corrective inputs that open communication would provide. By the time leadership detects the problem, it has metastasized far beyond the original concern. The third interaction is between the algorithmic mirror and the organizational immune system. This is one that I think deserves more attention than it has received. When organizations deploy AI and data analytics during change and transformation, they often do so with the belief that data will provide objective insight into what's working and what isn't. But as we explored in episode 4, AI systems trained on historical organizational data reflect the organization's existing patterns, biases, and assumptions. The algorithm mirror does not show you reality. It shows you a digitized version of the organization's past. And well, when the organizational immune system from episode 5 is active, which it always is during transformation, something particularly insidious happens. The immune system is already looking for reasons to reject the change, to label it as foreign, to build antibodies against it. So when the algorithmic mirror produces data that appears to support maintaining that status quo, the immune system uses that data as evidence. It is confirmation bias at an institutional scale, laundered through the technology that most stakeholders believe is objective. The data said the old approach is working. The algorithm confirms our existing processes while they're optimal. The dashboard shows that the transformation metrics are underperforming. None of those conclusions may be accurate, but they feel authoritative because they came from a machine. And, well, the immune system now has exactly the ammunition it needs to slow, dilute, or kill the change or transformation initiative. The fourth interaction connects the structural traps of middle management to nearly everything else. In episode 3, we explored how middle managers occupy a position that is structurally designed to produce failure during transformation. They're expected to translate executive vision into frontline execution while managing upward, downward, and laterally. They absorb the emotional weight of both sides. And they are the people most likely to be squeezed out of the very transformation that they're being asked to implement. Kwai Hoi's research at INSEAD specifically identified middle managers as what he called emotional balancers during organizational change. They're the people who absorb and process emotional reactions from both senior leadership and the frontline employees. His work demonstrated that when middle managers are structurally prevented from fulfilling this role, organizational change efforts are significantly more likely to fail. And that is what makes the structural trap so devastating as a systemic factor. Middle managers are the connective tissue of the organization. They are the primary channel through which communication flows, through which emotional contagion spreads or gets contained, through which structural silence is either reinforced or broken. So when middle managers are trapped, when they can't advocate upward for the concerns they hear from their teams, and they can't translate downward the executive intent that they don't fully understand or agree with, every other dimension gets worse. Contagion accelerates because the people who would normally moderate it, well, they're frozen. Silence deepens because the people closest to the front line have learned that honesty flows in only one direction. The immune system then strengthens because middle managers become its most effective agents, not by intention, but by structural position. They slow things down. They add caveats. They translate bold mandates into incremental adjustments, not because they oppose the change, but because the structure gives them no viable alternative. The fifth interaction is the one we explored most recently, the generational fault lines that run through all of the other dimensions. Ryan Venn and I discussed this in episode 8, but let me frame it specifically in terms of the interaction effects. The identity crisis from episode 1, well, it does not hit every generation the same way. A boomer has built 30 years of institutional experiences, a fundamental different identity threat from an AI deployment than a millennial who sees AI as a career accelerator. The psychological contract from episode 7 varies by generation because the implicit promises were different to begin with. Boomers were promised stability and upward mobility. Gen X was promised autonomy. Millennials were promised purpose and development. Gen Z was promised flexibility and authenticity. The same transformation violates 5 different contracts. Emotional contagion from episode 2 travels differently across generational frameworks because each generation, well, they have different communication preferences and different trust thresholds. Structural silence from episode 6 manifests differently because each generation has a different relationship to institutional authority and a different threshold for what they're willing to say out loud. A leader who treats all of these as the same resistance, who designs a single intervention for a multi generational workforce operating under multiple psychological contracts with different identity investments, well, is not leading transformation. They are performing it. So, what do you do with this? 8 dimensions that interact in ways that are complex, contextual, and different in every organization. The temptation is to say that this is too complicated to operationalize. It seems so hard. Where do I even start? Do I have the role and the influence to even raise the red flag? I understand the temptation and the internal questions that you may be asking yourself, but I think the complexity is actually clarifying if you approach it the right way. Andrew Pettigrew's longitudinal research on organizational transformation demonstrated that change must be understood across multiple interconnected levels. What is changing, how it is changing, and the internal and external conditions shaping the change. His work showed that organizations which analyzed only one level consistently underestimated the complexity of change or transformation. The diagnostic map I'm proposing operates on the same principle. It doesn't ask you to solve every dimension simultaneously. It asks you to see them before you intervene. Danella Meadows, in her work on systems thinking at MIT, identified something that I think is essential for leaders to absorb. She demonstrated that leverage points in complex systems are counterintuitive, and that single variable interventions in interconnected systems often produce the opposite of the intended effect. The most powerful leverage points are not the obvious ones. They are the ones that change the rules of the system: the mental models, the goals, and the feedback structures. That is what this diagnostic map is designed to help leaders find. The right way is not to build an intervention for each dimension. It is to use the dimensions as a diagnostic map. Before you design any change or transformation initiative, before you launch any change communication, before you roll out any new technology or restructure any team, you should be asking a set of diagnostic questions that correspond to these 8 dimensions. And the answers, well, they should shape your approach. So let's start. The identity question. Whose professional identity is threatened by this change? Not whose job is at risk, whose sense of who they are and what they are good at is being destabilized. Because identity threat triggers resistance that no amount of training or communication can overcome until it's acknowledged. Next, the contagion question. How is anxiety about this change currently spreading through the organization? Through which networks, which channels, which informal conversations? And more importantly, is your communication strategy designed to feed the formal channels, or are you seeding the narrative to the informal ones? The structural trap question. What are you asking middle managers to do that their structural positions make impossible? Are you asking them to champion a change that eliminates their own roles? Are you asking them to translate a strategy they weren't involved in designing? Are you asking them to absorb emotional weight from both directions without any support? Hmm. The algorithmic mirror question, well, is the data you are using to measure transformation progress reflecting the change you are trying to create? Or is it reflecting the patterns of the organization you are trying to leave behind? Hmm. Are your dashboards measuring adoption or compliance, behavioral change or performative engagement? The immune system question, where is the organization already building antibodies against this change? Which processes, committees, approval chains, and cultural norms are functioning to slow, dilute, or neutralize the transformation? And are you inadvertently strengthening the immune response by framing the change in ways that trigger organizational self preservation? The silence question. What is not being said? Where in the organization have people learned that honest feedback about this initiative is unsafe? If your feedback channels are producing only positive signals during a major transformation, well, that's not evidence that things are going well. That's evidence that structural silence is functioning exactly as it's designed. The contract question. What implicit promises is this change breaking? What did people believe the organization owed them that this transformation or change is withdrawing? And have you created space for people to grieve those losses? Or are you demanding enthusiasm for a future that requires them to abandon a past that they were told to build? And the generational question. Are you designing this change for a monolithic workforce or for the actual human beings in the room? Have you considered that the same initiative triggers different identity threats, different contract violations, different communication preferences, and different trust thresholds across the generational landscape of your organization? 8 questions, 8 diagnostic lenses, not a checklist to be completed, but a map to be consulted. And here's the most critical insight. You don't need to solve all 8 dimensions to succeed. You need to understand which dimensions are most active in your specific context and design your approach accordingly. The organization where structural silence is the dominant factor needs a fundamentally different intervention than the organization where the algorithmic mirror is reinforcing the immune system. The organization where middle management is structurally trapped needs different support than the organization where generational fault lines are the primary source of friction. The diagnostic map doesn't give you a universal prescription. It gives you the ability to see what is actually happening, which is the prerequisite for any intervention that has a chance of working. I want to close with why I think this particular moment demands this kind of systemic diagnostic thinking. We're in a period where change and transformation, pressures on organizations, are not only intensifying, they're converging. AI adoption is accelerating. Workforce demographics are shifting. Gen Z now comprises 40% of the current workforce. And Gen Alpha, well, in a few years, they'll be approaching employability. Remote and hybrid work models are still being negotiated. Economic uncertainty is reshaping organizational risk tolerance nationally and globally. And the pace of technological change, well, is outrunning most organizations' capacity and individual capacity to absorb it all. Each of those pressures activates multiple dimensions of the human factor simultaneously. AI adoption triggers identity crisis, reshapes psychological contracts, and creates algorithmic mirror effects. Workforce demographic shifts activate generational fault lines and change the emotional contagion pathways within an organization. Economic uncertainty strengthens the organization immune response and deepens structural silence because people are afraid that honesty will cost them their jobs. These aren't separate challenges requiring separate task forces. They are manifestations of the same underlying reality. Change and transformation are very human processes. And the organizations that treat it either as a technical or an operational process, well, they're going to continue to fail at the rates the research has predicted for over 30 years. The 70% failure rate that I reference often is not a curse. It is a diagnosis. John Carter's research placed it at that level in the mid 1990s. McKinsey's research confirmed similar figures across multiple studies from 2008 onward. Michael Beer's work at Harvard validated that the rate has remained remarkably stable across decades, despite massive investment in change management methodologies and consulting engagements. The stability of that failure rate is itself evidence that the problem is diagnostic, not methodological. We have not been using the wrong tools. We have been looking at the wrong level of the problem. We have been treating the symptoms, one dimension at a time, without ever stepping back to see the system. That is what the season has been building towards. Not 8 separate insights, but one integrated understanding of why change fails and what it takes to lead transformation that actually accounts for the full complexity of the human beings you are being asked to change. The remaining episodes of this season are going to build on and from this diagnostic map. Now that we have the framework, we need to apply it. We have guests coming who bring specific expertise to the dimensions we have been discussing. Practitioners who have lived inside these dynamics and who can show us what it looks like when leaders get it right and when they get it wrong. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe to the Human Factor Podcast wherever you watch or listen. Leave a rating and a comment and share this episode with your leadership team. If your organization is navigating change and transformation right now, this diagnostic map is designed to help you see what might be hiding in plain sight. Subscribe to the Ideas and Innovations newsletter on Substack for weekly frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. And connect with me on LinkedIn where I post regularly about the psychology of transformation. Next episode, we continue the journey. Until then, remember, change and transformation doesn't fail because of the technology, the strategy, or the market conditions. It fails because of people. And the more deeply you understand the human factor, the more likely your change or transformation is to succeed. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.